Imagine for a moment a time long before the rise of great empires, when the world was still wild, untamed, and filled with gods that walked among men. There was one god, a stormbringer, whose name would slowly evolve and transform across millennia. He started as a shadow on the edge of history, a distant tribal deity tied to storms and the wrath of nature. And yet over time, this god would transcend the limits of his origin, becoming the singular force that would shape the world's three major monotheistic religions. Who was this god? His name was Yahweh, but his story is far more complex than we have been taught. Yahweh's hidden origins are cloaked in the mists of time, an enigma so profound that it has been buried beneath layers of myth, politics, and divine rebranding. Did you know that Yahweh was not always the merciful and omnipotent God we know today? In the beginning, he was a tribal storm god, a deity of nature, bound to a small, struggling people on the fringes of the ancient world. His name was once whispered in the winds, associated with fierce storms and the battles of warlords. He was a force of nature, not yet the God of mercy and salvation we recognize today. But how did Yahweh make this incredible transformation? How did this once local warrior deity evolve into the cosmic, all-encompassing force of creation and salvation that governs not only Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also the philosophical and spiritual foundations of the modern world? In this video, we will journey through the forgotten corners of history and uncover the hidden story of Yahweh's evolution. We will explore how ancient Israel's gods were shaped by divine politics, the influence of foreign deities, and the struggles of a people in exile. We will reveal how Yahweh absorbed the identities of other gods, from the Canaanite storm god Baal to the ancient patriarch El, blending them into a divine identity that would eventually rule over the heavens and the earth. But not just any god. This god's rise wasn't just a theological evolution. It was the result of a profound cultural and political transformation. The rise of Yahweh wasn't just about theology. It was about the survival of a people, the redrawing of spiritual boundaries, and the creation of a new vision of God that would define empires, revolutionize the human understanding of morality, and shape the destiny of billions. So prepare yourself for a journey through time, one that challenges everything you thought you knew about God and the ancient forces that shaped our spiritual lives. The story of Yahweh is far older and far more complex than you can imagine. And as we peel back the layers of this hidden history, we may just uncover some secrets that change the way we see the world and our place within it. Stay with me, because the real mystery of Yahweh has only just begun. To truly understand the hidden origins of Yahweh, we must first step back in time, way back, into the ancient world, when gods were not abstract concepts but living, breathing forces that shaped the very fabric of existence. Our journey begins in the 14th century BCE, at a time when the ancient world was a mosaic of tribal gods, each fiercely guarding their own territories. The earliest known mention of Yahweh comes from Egyptian texts, where he is referred to as a toponym, a name linked to a place, not yet a god, but something mysterious, associated with semi-nomadic tribes in the harsh deserts of the ancient Near East. Here in these arid, windswept lands, Yahweh was not yet a deity to be worshipped, but perhaps a symbol of a tribe's struggle for survival. He was a shadow, not yet a force to reckon with. But what was Yahweh's true role during these early times? Was he merely a name for a place, or was he something more, a symbol of divine power waiting to be awakened? As we delve deeper, we find that Yahweh's story is entwined with the stories of other ancient gods, gods like El, the high god of the Canaanite pantheon, and Baal, the storm god. These gods would play a crucial role in shaping Yahweh's identity as we know it today. But at this point, Yahweh was still far from the omnipotent figure of the Hebrew Bible. His earliest form was that of a powerful yet local storm god, capable of controlling the skies, unleashing thunder and rain, and commanding the very elements of nature. In the ancient Near East, gods were often seen as patrons of specific tribes or peoples. They were not universal. They didn't control all aspects of existence. The world was populated by many gods, each with their own territory, their own spheres of influence. Yahweh was just one of these gods, his power tied to the land and people he governed. But then something extraordinary happened. A series of events would soon set Yahweh on a path of transformation. We begin to see signs of a shift during the period of the Israelites' exile. This was not just a political event. It was a spiritual crisis, one that would push Yahweh's identity into uncharted waters. The exilic period marked a turning point in the history of the Israelites, a time when they were forced to reckon with their identity in the face of overwhelming political and military defeat. The northern kingdom of Israel had already fallen to the Assyrians in the 8th century BCE, and the Judeans, the people of the southern kingdom, were soon to follow. But in the ashes of these defeats, a theological revolution was brewing. It was here, in the wake of destruction and exile, that Yahweh's identity began to shift. No longer was he simply the God of a small tribe. He was becoming something much greater. He was becoming a universal God, one who could not just protect a people, but who could potentially govern the entire world. The very existence of the Israelites, now scattered and oppressed, depended on a new vision of God, one that transcended tribal boundaries and embraced the idea of a singular, omnipotent deity that would rule over all. Why was this shift necessary? Why did Yahweh need to evolve from a local storm god to a universal deity? The answer lies in the deep spiritual and political crises faced by the Israelites. Their survival depended on their ability to see themselves not just as a small tribe with a local god, but as a people with a universal destiny. And in order to do so, they had to break free from the gods of their neighbors and elevate their God, Yahweh, above all others. Philosophically, this was a profound shift. The idea of a universal God meant that Yahweh was not just the God of one people, but the ruler of the entire cosmos. The implications were far-reaching. It meant that Yahweh was not confined to the heavens, the storms, or the local battles of the Israelites. He was now the creator of all things, a God whose sovereignty extended beyond the borders of Israel and encompassed the entire world. This new conception of Yahweh would have profound consequences, not only for the Israelites, but for the entire spiritual landscape of the ancient world. It would eventually lead to the birth of monotheism, the belief in one God who ruled all. But the road to this transformation was far from simple. It would involve complex theological debates, cultural syncretism, and a reimagining of Yahweh's very nature. In our next section, we will dive deeper into this evolution, exploring how Yahweh absorbed elements of other gods and became more than just a storm deity. The process of syncretism, the blending of different religious traditions, was key to this transformation. But how did this fusion of divine characteristics shape the very nature of Yahweh? How did a God originally tied to thunderstorms and war become the merciful and omnipotent creator of the universe? The story is about to get even more intriguing. Stay tuned. Now that we've set the stage, let's dig deeper into the core of Yahweh's transformation. The journey from a tribal storm god to the universal, all-encompassing deity that we know today didn't happen overnight. It was a slow and complex evolution, shaped by the forces of history, culture, and religion. To understand this transition, we must first explore the roots of Yahweh's identity in the ancient world. Yahweh's earliest role was one of raw power. He was a god of the storms, the winds, and the rains, forces that could both nourish and destroy. The Canaanite pantheon, which included gods like El and Baal, was richly diverse, with each god ruling over a specific domain. El was the high god, a wise and ancient deity associated with cosmic order and justice, while Baal was the god of storms and fertility, a fierce and charismatic figure tied to the seasonal cycles of rain and drought. These gods were often invoked in rituals aimed at ensuring prosperity and the survival of the people. In these early days, Yahweh was very much a part of this divine tapestry. He wasn't unique, he was one among many. But his power, like the storm itself, was formidable. Storm gods were among the most feared and revered, for they controlled the weather, a force that could either bring life or devastation. Yahweh, in his storm god persona, was likely seen as a protector, a god who could shield his people from the wrath of nature or use it to smite their enemies. His role was deeply embedded in the daily struggles of the people, survival in a harsh, unpredictable world. But something began to change. As the Israelites moved through different periods of political upheaval and exile, they found themselves at a crossroads, both spiritually and philosophically. The idea of Yahweh as merely a tribal god, tied to storms and local warfare, could no longer satisfy the existential questions and needs of a people who had been scattered and crushed by foreign powers. The God of Israel had to evolve into something more, something that could transcend the geographical, cultural, and theological boundaries of his original role. This moment of crisis set the stage for the syncretic process that would reshape Yahweh. As we've seen before, syncretism refers to the blending of different religious ideas and deities into a single unified figure. This was not a haphazard process. It was a deliberate theological evolution. Yahweh began to absorb traits from other gods in the surrounding Canaanite pantheon. El, the high god of the Canaanites, was particularly influential in this transformation. El was the god of wisdom, the father of the gods, and a figure associated with the creation of the world. He was a god who stood above all others, a figure whose authority was unquestioned. As Yahweh absorbed elements of El's persona, he began to take on a more paternalistic, wise and just character. This shift marked the beginning of Yahweh's transformation from a volatile storm god to a god who governed not just nature, but the cosmic order itself. But it didn't stop there. Baal, the storm god of the Canaanites, also left his mark on Yahweh. Baal's warrior-like characteristics, his role as the bringer of rain and fertility, became part of Yahweh's expanding identity. The elements of Baal's fierce nature, his connection to the forces of war and strength, were woven into Yahweh's character, especially during times of conflict. In this way, Yahweh became a more complex deity, one who could bring both justice and mercy, destruction and salvation, depending on the circumstances. This syncretism allowed Yahweh to evolve beyond the confines of a regional god. His power was no longer limited to storms and fertility. He was now a cosmic force, capable of governing not just the weather, but the very fabric of existence. He could control the heavens and the earth, and his authority stretched far beyond the borders of Israel. However, it's important to note that this blending of divine identities was not without tension. The syncretic process involved the integration of different religious ideas, some of which were in direct opposition to one another. The warrior attributes of Baal, for example, stood in stark contrast to the merciful, just nature of El. These tensions would later become central to the theological debates that defined the evolution of Yahweh. What does this blending of gods tell us about the nature of Yahweh? It tells us that Yahweh was not a static, fixed entity. Rather, he was a God in flux, constantly evolving, to meet the needs of the people and the changing political and spiritual landscapes. This is an important point. The very essence of Yahweh's being was shaped by the historical and cultural context in which he was worshipped. Theological evolution, however, is not just about the absorption of traits from other deities. It's also about the philosophical and existential questions that arise in times of crisis. As the Israelites faced exile and domination, they began to ask deeper questions about the nature of God, the problem of suffering, and the meaning of their existence as a people. The idea of Yahweh as a universal deity, one who transcended his tribal roots, was the answer to these questions. By elevating Yahweh to the status of a cosmic, omnipotent God, the Israelites could understand their suffering as part of a larger divine plan. Yahweh was no longer just their storm god. He was the creator of all, the ruler of the heavens and the earth, the God of mercy and justice for all people, not just Israel. But the transformation of Yahweh was far from complete. The next step in his evolution would take him from the personal, vengeful God of the storms to a universal God who was not only capable of wrath but also of mercy, forgiveness, and salvation. And so we must ask, how did this shift occur? How did Yahweh become the God who would one day be worshipped as the all-powerful Creator, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What philosophical and theological shifts were necessary to bring Yahweh to his final form as the God of monotheism? Stay with me, because we're about to venture into the next phase of this extraordinary transformation. The true mystery of Yahweh is still unfolding. As we continue to unravel the mysteries of Yahweh's transformation, we must delve into a concept that played a pivotal role in shaping his identity: syncretism. This process, the blending of different religious traditions, deities, and beliefs, was crucial in Yahweh's evolution from a tribal storm God to the all-powerful universal deity we recognize today. At the heart of syncretism lies a fascinating truth. Gods are not static, but dynamic, shifting and evolving in response to the needs of the people who worship them. In the ancient world, gods were often absorbed into one another. Their identities merged and reshaped over time. For Yahweh, this process was particularly important. As Israelite society expanded and encountered other cultures and belief systems, the character of their God began to absorb the traits of neighboring deities, creating a more complex and multifaceted divine figure. Yahweh's syncretic journey began with his initial fusion with the Canaanite god El. As the high god of the Canaanite pantheon, El was associated with wisdom, justice, and cosmic order. He was revered as the father of gods, the creator of the universe, and the eternal ruler who governed all things. El's influence on Yahweh was profound. By adopting El's attributes, Yahweh became not just a god of war and storms, but a God who could govern the cosmos with wisdom and justice. This move toward cosmic authority was a natural evolution for Yahweh, as it allowed him to transcend his limited, regional role and embrace a universal one. Yet this was just the beginning. Yahweh's assimilation didn't stop with El. The storm god Baal, another prominent figure in the Canaanite pantheon, also contributed his traits to Yahweh's identity. Baal was a fierce and charismatic god, associated with the power of storms and rain, forces that were essential for the fertility of the land. He was the bringer of life and death, a warrior god whose actions were directly tied to the survival of the people. Yahweh, in his syncretic evolution, took on Baal's warrior attributes, adopting his power over the storms and his role as a protector of the people. But there was a deeper purpose to this assimilation. Yahweh's syncretism wasn't simply about acquiring divine traits, it was about survival. The Israelites were in a precarious position, constantly facing external threats and internal divisions. They needed a God who could not only rule over nature and the cosmos, but also protect them in times of war and uncertainty. By blending elements of El and Baal, Yahweh became the ultimate protector, a God who could command both the forces of nature and the armies of men. This blending of divine attributes wasn't unique to Yahweh. It was a common practice in the ancient Near East. Gods were not fixed, isolated figures. They were often adapted and reinterpreted as needed. In this context, Yahweh's syncretism was a reflection of the changing needs of Israelite society. As the Israelites struggled to survive in the face of foreign conquests and internal upheaval, they reimagined their God as a figure who could encompass all their needs, a God of wisdom, war, fertility, and cosmic order. But there's an even deeper layer to this syncretic process. Yahweh's transformation also reflects the theological tensions that were brewing within Israelite society. As we've seen, syncretism often involves blending incompatible divine characteristics. Baal's warrior ethos and El's cosmic wisdom didn't always align harmoniously, and these tensions would eventually come to the surface. Yahweh's evolution, therefore, wasn't just about assimilation, it was about reconciliation. The merging of these divine identities required a philosophical and theological reconciliation of seemingly opposed qualities. Justice and mercy, war and peace, wrath and forgiveness, this tension within Yahweh's identity, his ability to embody both the fierce warrior and the merciful creator, would become one of the most defining features of his character in the later stages of his evolution. It was a theological conundrum that would set the stage for the development of ideas about divine justice and mercy, themes that are central to the Hebrew Bible and later Christian and Islamic thought. Yahweh's dual nature, as both a God of destruction and a God of salvation, raised important questions about the nature of good and evil, suffering and redemption that would resonate throughout history. But let's pause for a moment and consider the deeper significance of Yahweh's syncretism. The assimilation of Baal and El's traits wasn't just a theological move, it was a cultural one. The Israelites were part of a vibrant and diverse world, filled with competing gods, ideologies, and spiritual practices. To maintain their identity in the face of these challenges, they needed to elevate their God above all others. Yahweh's transformation wasn't just about power. It was about the very survival of the Israelite people and their sense of purpose in a world that often seemed hostile and uncertain. The next stage in Yahweh's evolution would take him even further from his storm god origins. As the Israelites faced the destruction of their kingdoms and the trauma of exile, they began to reimagine their relationship with their God in even more radical ways. Yahweh would no longer just be the God of storms and war. He would become the universal, all-encompassing deity whose sovereignty extended to all of creation. But how did this shift happen? How did Yahweh, the storm god of the desert, become the cosmic ruler of all existence? The answer lies in a deeper theological evolution, one that would see Yahweh not just as a powerful God, but as the one true God, the God of monotheism. And that, my friends, is where the true mystery of Yahweh's transformation lies. As Yahweh's identity grew more complex, he was not only absorbing the characteristics of other gods, but also undergoing a profound theological evolution. The storm god who once dominated the desert winds, bringing thunder and lightning as a fierce warrior, was now on the cusp of becoming something entirely new, a universal creator, merciful and just. This wasn't simply a matter of acquiring new traits. It was the result of a shift in how Yahweh was perceived and a transformation in the very essence of the divine. The theological evolution of Yahweh is one of the most fascinating aspects of his journey. To understand this transition, we need to examine how the Israelites' understanding of God evolved from a deity tied to the physical world, to one who transcended it. This shift, which occurred over centuries, was driven by the changing political, social, and philosophical landscape of Israelite society. And, of course, it was influenced by the traumatic experiences of exile, conquest, and destruction. In the early days of Yahweh worship, his identity was inseparable from the physical world. As a storm god, he was closely associated with natural phenomena, thunder, rain, lightning, elements that were crucial for agricultural societies. The Israelites, living in a world where survival depended on the rains and the harvests, saw Yahweh as a force of nature, a God who could control the very elements. He was both protector and punisher, capable of bringing life through rain or death through drought. His power was tangible, immediate, and earthbound. But as the Israelites faced greater political and existential challenges, namely the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians, the Babylonian exile, and the eventual fall of Jerusalem, their understanding of Yahweh began to change. The Israelites, now scattered and oppressed, could no longer rely solely on a God who ruled over nature. They needed a God who could transcend the limitations of the earthbound, a God whose power could extend beyond the physical realm and offer them hope in their darkest hour. This marked the beginning of Yahweh's theological evolution from a tribal god of storms to a universal cosmic deity. This transition was both intellectual and emotional. The people needed a God who could provide them with more than just the material blessings of the earth, food, rain, and protection from enemies. They needed a God who could offer them hope, redemption, and salvation in a world that seemed overwhelmingly chaotic and unjust. In response to this need, Yahweh began to evolve into a more abstract, universal figure, one who governed not just nature, but the cosmos. He became a God who could exist beyond the realm of storms, a God who was omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. This was a profound shift. Yahweh was no longer confined to the skies or to specific geographical locations. He became the creator of all things, the ruler of both heaven and earth, who was not bound by the limitations of the physical world. One of the most significant aspects of this transformation was the development of Yahweh's moral character. In his early form, Yahweh was a fierce and sometimes vengeful deity. He was capable of great wrath, often punishing the Israelites for their disobedience with natural disasters or military defeat. But as Yahweh's identity evolved, so did his moral nature. He began to be portrayed as a God who not only commanded justice, but also embodied mercy and forgiveness. This transformation was deeply philosophical, as it reflected the Israelites' growing understanding of the complexities of good and evil, suffering and redemption. The theological shift from Yahweh as a warrior God to a merciful creator was influenced by the apocalyptic thinking that emerged. During the exilic and post-exilic periods, apocalypticism, an esoteric belief in a cosmic struggle between good and evil, often ending in divine judgment and the restoration of order, provided a framework for understanding Yahweh's role as the ultimate judge and redeemer of the world. Under this paradigm, Yahweh was no longer just a tribal protector, but the universal judge of all humanity, capable of judging not just the Israelites, but all nations. His wrath and mercy were now part of a larger divine plan to bring about the restoration of order in a world that had gone astray. One of the most profound ways in which this theological evolution manifested was in the concept of salvation. As the Israelites grappled with their exile, they began to see Yahweh not just as a God who could deliver them from earthly enemies, but as a God who could offer salvation on a cosmic scale. This shift towards universal salvation was part of Yahweh's transformation into a God who could offer redemption not just to the Israelites, but to all of humanity. The seeds of this universalism would later blossom in the teachings of prophets like Isaiah, who envisioned a day when all nations would recognize Yahweh as the one true God. But what does this mean for us thousands of years later? Yahweh's theological evolution teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of the divine, that the gods we worship are not fixed, but dynamic, constantly evolving to meet the needs and understanding of the people who call upon them. Yahweh's transformation reflects the very human need to understand and connect with the divine in ways that transcend the limitations of the material world. Moreover, the shift from Yahweh as a storm god to a universal merciful deity reflects a deeper truth about the spiritual journey. In the beginning, we may understand the divine through the physical world, through nature, storms, and power. But as we grow, as we face the challenges of life, we come to understand that the divine is not just in the world, but beyond it. It is both immanent and transcendent, capable of judgment and mercy, wrath and love. The evolution of Yahweh's character parallels the human quest for a more profound understanding of the divine, one that embraces both the chaos of the world and the possibility of salvation. The final stage in Yahweh's evolution, however, would take him even further, from a cosmic God of justice to the monotheistic deity, whose singular authority would be recognized as supreme by all. But how did this happen? How did the God of Israel, originally tied to the land and people, come to be seen as the one true God for all of humanity? The answer lies in the final chapter of Yahweh's transformation, and we are approaching that monumental moment. The evolution of Yahweh from a local tribal storm god to the universal deity of monotheism did not happen in isolation. It was profoundly shaped by the political and religious forces at play in the ancient world, especially during times of crisis, exile, and reform. The Israelites, as a small and often oppressed people, found themselves grappling with complex theological questions about the nature of God, the survival of their nation, and their place in a world dominated by empires. It was in these turbulent periods that Yahweh's identity was most radically transformed. The first major turning point came with the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE, and the subsequent Babylonian exile of the southern kingdom of Judah in the 6th century BCE. The Israelites, once scattered and subjected to foreign rule, began to ask deeper questions about their God and their relationship to Him. Was Yahweh, the God of Israel, truly powerful enough to protect His people from foreign invaders? And if He was, why had Israel been defeated? These were the questions that haunted the exiled Israelites, and they drove them to reimagine their God as something far greater than her tribal deity bound to a specific people or land. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the exile to Babylon marked a seismic shift in Israelite theology. No longer could the Israelites rely on the old ways of worship, centered around a localized temple and the practices tied to their land. They could no longer see Yahweh as simply the God of a specific territory. In this moment of crisis, a new theological vision began to take shape, one that would lay the groundwork for Yahweh's ultimate transformation into a universal deity. During the exile, many of the Israelites began to focus on monolatry, the belief in the worship of one God while acknowledging the existence of others. But this belief was gradually replaced by monotheism, the conviction that Yahweh was not only the God of Israel, but the only true God, who ruled over all creation. This shift was not immediate. It was a gradual process that took place over several generations. The exiled Israelites, struggling to understand their place in a vast and hostile world, began to reframe their understanding of Yahweh as the sole God, one who controlled not just Israel, but the entire universe. One key moment in this theological shift occurred during the reforms of King Josiah of Judah in the late 7th century BCE. Josiah, in his efforts to centralize religious worship in Jerusalem and eliminate the worship of foreign gods, promoted Yahweh as the sole deity. This was a bold political and religious move, one that would set the stage for the later development of monotheism. But Josiah's reforms were not simply about religious consolidation. They were also about redefining the identity of Yahweh as the singular God who would unify the people of Israel and establish their relationship with the divine on a universal scale. As the Israelites returned from exile and rebuilt their society, the influence of these reforms became even more pronounced. The prophets of the post-exilic period, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, began to articulate a vision of Yahweh that was not just concerned with the fate of Israel, but with the destiny of all nations. Yahweh's sovereignty was no longer seen as limited to Israel alone. He was now envisioned as the ruler of all creation. The prophetic visions of a future where Yahweh would judge all nations and restore order to the world were foundational in shaping the understanding of Yahweh as a universal God. But it wasn't just the Israelites who played a role in Yahweh's evolution. The Hellenistic influence after the conquest of the region by Alexander the Great also contributed to this transformation. Hellenistic philosophy, especially the philosophical ideas surrounding the one and the unity of all things, helped shape the idea of Yahweh as a singular, transcendent being who was beyond time, space, and all earthly constraints. The influence of Greek thought, combined with Jewish theological developments, gave rise to a vision of God that was not just personal, but cosmic. This period of intellectual exchange between Greek and Jewish thought created fertile ground for the development of the idea of Yahweh as the one true God, a singular force that transcended the physical world and was responsible for all of creation. The blending of these philosophical ideas with Israelite monotheism would eventually shape the concept of God in both Christianity and Islam, where Yahweh, or God, is understood as the ultimate creator of all things, with absolute dominion over the universe. The rise of monotheism was, therefore, not just a theological shift, it was also deeply political. It was a response to the pressures of empire, the need for identity in a world dominated by foreign powers, and the longing for a unifying force that could provide stability and purpose in a world of chaos. Yahweh's transformation from a localized God to the universal deity of monotheism gave the Israelites the spiritual and political cohesion they needed to survive as a people. But the political implications of this shift did not stop with the Israelites. The concept of Yahweh as the one true God would later spread to other cultures through the missionary efforts of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The political and religious influence of Yahweh's evolution would ultimately shape the development of empires, cultures, and civilizations across the globe. Yahweh's transformation, then, was not just a religious change. It was a transformation that touched every aspect of Israelite society, politics, and culture. The evolution of Yahweh from a storm god to a universal creator reflects the deep need for a God who could transcend the limitations of time, space, and human suffering. It was the divine response to the questions of meaning and purpose that arose in times of crisis. In the end, Yahweh's political and religious influence became so profound that his identity would shape the course of human history. His transformation from a tribal god to the one true God would set the stage for the rise of three of the world's largest religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Each of these traditions would draw upon the legacy of Yahweh interpreting his identity in different ways, but all acknowledging his central role as the divine force that governs all creation. As we now stand at the threshold of Yahweh's final evolution into the monotheistic deity that would be worshipped by billions across the world, we are left with one fundamental question. How does Yahweh's journey from a tribal God to a universal deity shape our own understanding of God today? What does it mean for us in this modern world to connect with a God who has transcended his earthly origins to become the creator of all things? These are the questions we must ponder as we continue to explore the final chapter of Yahweh's story. At the apex of Yahweh's theological evolution stands the transformative moment when he became not just the God of Israel, but the one true God, the sole creator of the universe, the singular divine force that governs all things. This was the crowning achievement of Yahweh's long journey from a tribal storm god to the universal deity of monotheism, and it marked the culmination of centuries of theological, political, and philosophical development. The journey to monotheism was not instantaneous, nor was it a simple matter of eliminating other gods. Rather, it was a complex and gradual process, shaped by Israel's history, the influence of neighboring empires, and the evolving spiritual needs of the Israelites themselves. The moment when Yahweh emerged as the one true God was the product of a profound spiritual revolution, one that would alter the course of human history and give rise to three of the world's largest and most influential religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The final leap into monotheism occurred in the aftermath of Israel's political upheavals, especially during and after the Babylonian exile. As we've seen earlier, the exile was a moment of profound crisis for the Israelites. Their homeland had been destroyed, their temple desecrated, and their people scattered across the foreign land of Babylon. It was in this moment of vulnerability that a new vision of God began to take shape, a vision of a God who was not bound by the limits of time, space, or geography, but one who was sovereign over all creation. The prophets of the exilic and post-exilic periods played a crucial role in this shift. Isaiah, in particular, is one of the key figures in articulating Yahweh's universal sovereignty. In passages like Isaiah 45:5-6, Yahweh declares, "I am the Lord and there is no other. Apart from me there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me." These words were not just a theological statement. They were a declaration that Yahweh was not only the God of Israel, but the only God who truly existed, the one who created and ruled over all things both in the heavens and on the earth. This declaration of monotheism was radical. It challenged not only the religious beliefs of the Israelites' neighbors, but also their own understanding of Yahweh. For centuries, the Israelites had practiced monolatry, worshipping Yahweh as the supreme God while acknowledging the existence of other gods. But now, under the influence of prophetic visions and the traumatic experience of exile, the Israelites were coming to the realization that Yahweh was not just the God of Israel. He was the only true God, and all other gods were false. But what does this shift mean, both for the Israelites and for us today? For the Israelites, the rise of monotheism was deeply connected to their sense of identity. In a world dominated by powerful empires like Babylon and Persia, the idea of Yahweh as the one true God gave the Israelites a sense of spiritual and cultural coherence. No longer would they have to compete with the gods of their neighbors. Yahweh was the only God who mattered, and his sovereignty was absolute. This monotheistic vision provided a sense of security and hope in a world that seemed dominated by foreign powers and their gods. Yet this radical shift in the understanding of God was not just a political move, it was a philosophical revolution. The idea that there could be only one true God, that Yahweh was the creator of all things, and that all other gods were false, opened up a whole new way of thinking about the nature of existence, creation, and the divine order. This was a God who was not confined to one tribe or one people, but a God who existed outside of time and space, transcending the material world. He was not just a God of storms or fertility or war. He was the creator, the sustainer, and the judge of all things. His will governed the entire cosmos. This vision of God as the one true God had profound implications not only for Israel, but for the entire world. It would later be adopted by Christianity and Islam, where Yahweh, now understood as God the Father in Christianity, and Allah in Islam, would become the central figure in the lives of billions of people. But the idea of monotheism, as it was first articulated by the Israelites, was not just a theological shift, it was a cultural transformation that would shape the course of history for millennia to come. The theological implications of Yahweh's rise to monotheism are vast. Monotheism doesn't just tell us that there is one God, it redefines the relationship between humanity and the divine. In a polytheistic world, gods were often seen as distant, unpredictable forces, each with their own domain and desires. But in monotheism, the one true God is not only all-powerful but also deeply personal. Yahweh's transformation into the one true God marks a shift from a distant, impersonal force of nature to a God who is intimately involved with the world and its people. He is a God who is concerned with justice, mercy, and salvation, one who is not just the ruler of the heavens but the guide of humanity's moral and spiritual journey. This was a revolutionary concept, one that would later shape not just religious thought, but also political and ethical philosophy. The idea that there is one God, that all people are equal in the eyes of this God, and that this God is just and merciful, laid the foundation for the development of ideas about human dignity, rights, and justice. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Yahweh's transformation into the one true God is its universality. By declaring that Yahweh was the only true God, the Israelites were not just elevating their God above the gods of their neighbors. They were making a profound statement about the unity of all creation. This vision of a single, all-powerful deity was not just a reflection of the Israelites' spiritual needs, it was a universal truth that would resonate across cultures, faiths, and civilizations. It was a declaration that the divine is not confined to any one people or place, but that it transcends all boundaries, embracing all of humanity. As we reflect on the rise of monotheism, we are left with an open question. What does it mean for us today to worship the one true God? How do we reconcile the divine with the complex, often chaotic world we live in? Yahweh's transformation into the universal God provides a model for how religious beliefs can evolve and adapt, how they can shape our understanding of morality, justice, and the nature of existence. But it also challenges us to think about the unity of all people under one divine force, and how that understanding can shape our world today. The story of Yahweh is not just the story of a God. It is the story of a people, a civilization, and ultimately, the entire world's spiritual and philosophical evolution, from his humble beginnings as a local storm god, tied to the land and people of Israel, to his transformation into the one true God of monotheism. Yahweh's journey reflects the deep currents of human history, culture, and faith. His evolution was shaped by the pressing challenges of survival, exile, and the quest for understanding in a world marked by chaos and uncertainty. Yahweh's rise to prominence did not happen in isolation. It was the product of a complex interplay of theology, politics, and philosophy. His transformation was marked by the blending of divine identities through syncretism, absorbing traits from gods like El and Baal, and it was influenced by the political needs of the Israelites who, in the face of destruction and exile, needed a God who could provide not only protection, but hope and salvation on a cosmic scale. As the people of Israel faced the overwhelming power of foreign empires, they reimagined their relationship with their God, elevating Yahweh to the role of the universal creator, the ruler of all things, the one who transcends the limitations of time, space, and human suffering. This transformation was far more than a theological shift. It was a radical philosophical revolution. Yahweh's transition from a God of nature, storms and warfare to a universal, merciful, and just deity reshaped not only the religious landscape of Israel, but also the very idea of the divine. Yahweh, in his final form as the one true God, laid the foundation for the development of monotheism, a belief system that would spread across the world, shaping the religious and ethical principles of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and profoundly influencing the course of human history. As we reflect on this journey, we are left with a deeper understanding of the nature of God and the way religious ideas evolve. The story of Yahweh shows us that the divine is not static. It is dynamic, changing, and responding to the needs of humanity. It is a reminder that our conception of God too is always in flux, shaped by our experiences, our struggles, and our quest for meaning in a world that often feels beyond our control. In the modern world, Yahweh's legacy continues to resonate. His evolution from a storm god to a universal deity challenges us to rethink our relationship with the divine. What does it mean to worship a God who is not bound by time, place, or tribe? How can we apply the lessons of Yahweh's journey to our own spiritual lives, to our understanding of justice, mercy, and redemption? And perhaps most importantly, how does the idea of the one true God shape the way we see ourselves in relation to others, to the world, and to the divine? The journey of Yahweh is not just an ancient story. It is an ongoing narrative, one that continues to unfold in our lives today. As we explore the depths of his transformation, we are reminded that the divine is both immanent and transcendent, and that our search for truth, meaning, and connection with the divine is as relevant today as it was in the ancient world. As we close this chapter of Yahweh's story, we are left with one final question. What does it mean to seek the one true God in a world that is often divided, chaotic, and uncertain? Yahweh's journey offers no easy answers, but it does offer us a path of spiritual growth, transformation, and a deeper understanding of the divine that transcends the boundaries of time and space. The mystery of Yahweh's origins may never be fully unraveled, but in exploring this ancient journey, we gain insight into the mysteries of our own spiritual paths, and that perhaps is the greatest revelation of all.